Welcome to the Heathen Trans Girl podcast with me, your host, Kaya Fox. Today we are talking about Jormungandr, one of Loki and Angrboda's three children, the world serpent or the Midgard-Serpent, giant snaky boy. We have a handful of attestations today. I think the main stories are the birth of Jormungandr, Jormungandr the kitty snake, fishing for Jormungandr, and Jormungandr at Ragnarok, as well as a handful of Kennings. So as always, I want to give a huge thank you to those who have given permission for me to read from their translations. So today that is going to be Jackson Crawford's team at Hackett Publishing for letting me read some of the Poetic Edda 2015 translation. And then my other sources are Public Domain, Poetic Edda, Henry Adams Bellows, 1936, and Prose Edda, Arthur Gilchrist Brodeur, 1916. So if you have been with us for the last couple of episodes, we've been talking about Angrboda and Hel. So Angrboda is Jormungandr's mother, and Hel is Jormungandr's sister. So the very first attestation that we're going to read from today is one that we mentioned in the last two as well, but it's only a handful of sentences, and it gives some context. So if you're jumping in here for the first one, we're just going to start with that, lay some of the groundwork. And as I mentioned in the last couple of episodes too, like we can learn about these characters by learning more about their family, those that they come in contact with, and how some of these stories kind of overlap thematically with each other. So that's kind of what I'm trying to do here in discussing Loki and Angrboda's three children. We'll hit Fenrir next, and then Loki to kind of round out this family set. So, without further ado, Gylfaginning, Chapter 34, Prose Edda, Brodeur translation. Of the children of Loki and the binding of the Fenris wolf. Yet more children had Loki. Angrboda was the name of a certain giantess in Jotunheim, with whom Loki got 3 children. One was Fenris wolf. The second, Jormungandr, that is, the Midgard-Serpent. The third is Hel. But when the gods learned that this kindred was nourished in Jotunheim, and when the gods perceived by prophecy that from this kindred great misfortune should befall them, and since it seemed to all that there was great prospect of ill, first from the mother's blood, and yet worse from the father's, then All-Father sent gods thither to take the children and bring them to him. When they came to him, he straightway cast the serpent into the deep sea, where he lies about all the land. And this serpent grew so greatly that he lies in the midst of the ocean, encompassing all the land, and bites upon his own tail. So a few quick things to note about this passage. The first one I wanted to discuss was the perception that great ill was to come from these 3 children because of a prophecy. It doesn't specify which prophecy. I typically think of that one as like the Völuspá, one of the first poems, usually in the collection of the Poetic Edda. But that kind of brings to mind this idea of like the self-fulfilling prophecy. Just because something like was prophesied doesn't mean that you don't have a hand in perpetuating it. It could also be that like this was going to happen no matter what, but the reason why it was going to happen didn't come up in the prophecy. And this is just my own interpretation, and we'll get into it a little bit more in the Fenrir episode. But I think that this action of taking the 3 children and casting Hel into Niflheim and casting Jormungandr into the sea and I mean, I don't think it's that big of a spoiler, but the binding of Fenrir, I think those actions kind of perpetuate the prophecy of misfortune coming from these children. Okay, I will leave that one there. Maybe we'll discuss it more in the Fenrir episode. The second thing that I wanted to mention real quick was this idea that Jormungandr grew so big that he could encompass all the land and bite on his own tail. Now, when we think of the world as a globe, that doesn't really make sense. I mean, like, I guess we could circle it along the equator, but not really, because the ocean doesn't run the whole way like that. Anyway, it makes more sense if we think of it kind of like an island. And actually in Gylfaginning chapter 8, I'm not going to read from it, but just summarizing, it says that there is essentially a sea, and then on the shore of this sea, in a circle, is Utgard, and in the center of Utgard is Midgard, and within Midgard is Asgard. And so we get this circular kind of bullseye effect with the ocean laying around the outside. And so it would make sense in that context for Jormungandr to circle around the outside and bite his own tail, which kind of brings to mind the Ouroboros imagery. Although I don't know if that's something that like totally existed within that mindset at that time, but it's something that I associate thematically. I'll leave that one up to you. Okay. Next attestation. Our next attestation is going to be coming from Gylfaginning, chapter 46 of the Prose Edda Brodeur translation. So this is a story in which Thor, Loki, and a couple of other companions are traveling outside. Utgard basically just means like the outside, the wilds, the further out. In that little bullseye discussion that we just had, it's what lies directly in from the sea that Jormungandr circles around, then further in from that, Midgard and then Asgard. Anyway, they go to Utgard Loki's hall and are participating in a series of challenges. Thor fails a drinking challenge directly prior to this. And then we pick up with, "Then said Utgard Loki, now it is evident that thy prowess is not so great as we thought it to be. But wilt thou try thy hand at more games? It may readily be seen that thou gettest no advantage hereof." Thor answered, "I will make trial of yet other games. But it would have seemed wonderful to me when I was at home with the Æsir if such drinks had been called so little. But what game will ye offer me now?" Then said Utgard Loki, "Young lads here are wont to do this, which is thought of small consequence. Lift my cat up from the earth. But I should not have been able to speak of such things to Asa Thor if I had not seen that thou hast far less in thee than I had thought." Thereupon there leapt forth on the hall floor a grey cat, and a very big one, and Thor went to it and took it with his hand down under the middle of the belly and lifted up. But the cat bent into an arch just as Thor stretched up his hands, and when Thor reached up as high as he could at the very utmost, then the cat lifted up 1 foot. And Thor got this game no further advanced. Then Utgard Loki said, "This game went even as I had foreseen. The cat is very great, whereas Thor is low and little beside the huge men who are here with us." There is then one more challenge of wrestling, which does not go the way that Thor wants it to go. And then we pick up with Thor and his companions leaving, Utgard Loki escorting them out, and then Utgard Loki said, Now I will tell you the truth, now that thou art come out of the castle, and if I live and am able to prevail, then thou shalt never again come into it. Midgard-Loki then reveals the trick of the drinking challenge. We'll skip that because I'm going to come back to it on our Thor episode. And again he said, "It seemed to me not less noteworthy when thou didst lift up the cat, and to tell thee truly, then all were afraid who saw how thou didst lift 1 foot clear of the earth. That cat was not as it appeared to thee. It was the Midgard-Serpent, which lies about all the land, and scarcely does its length suffice to encompass the earth with head and tail. So high didst thou stretch up thine arms, that it was then but a little way more to heaven." I cannot say how the mechanisms and the mechanics of describing a giant sea serpent as a cat work, but it is a fantastic mental image. Having this big, long, stretchy cat that arches its back all the way up and is actually a snake. Yeah, great mental image. Other than being a fun story, though, maybe I will spoil it a little bit. We'll save like the actual reading of this entire story for a later episode, but I think it's revealing here that the drinking challenge is actually a deception where Thor is drinking from the sea and actually empties the ocean enough to cause the tides to become a thing. And in the wrestling match, Loki is wrestling with like old age, like the imminence of death. And in that wrestling match, the woman who is old age disguised is only manages to get Thor down onto one knee and no further. And so Midgard-Loki is kind of intimidated by Thor, because I think it's this set of like natural forces that almost no one can resist. Forces like the ocean and old age. And it's interesting that Jormungandr is included in there, because Thor manages to resist or push back against these almost insurmountable things. I think that's the connection I want to make here, is that Jormungandr is this thing that is next to as impossible as defeating old age or drinking the ocean. Lifting Jormungandr is that impossible, and yet Thor seems to accomplish it, or make a very little teeny bit of headway into that which is impossible. All right, for our next attestation or group of attestations, we're going to stick with the theme of Jormungandr and Thor. So we're starting in Hymiskviða, stanzas 22 through 26 of the Poetic Edda Bellows translation. And this is the story of the time that Thor goes fishing for Jormungandr. 2 whales on his hook did the mighty Hymir soon pull up on a single cast. In the stern, the kinsman of Odin, aka Thor, sat, and with cunning his cast prepared. The warder of men, the worm destroyer, fixed on his hook the head of the ox. There gaped at the bait the foe of the gods, the girdler of all the earth beneath. The venomous serpent swiftly up to the boat did Thor, the bold one, pull. With his hammer, the loathly hill of the hair of the brother of Fenrir he smote from above. The monsters roared, and the rocks resounded, and all the earth so old was shaken. Then sank the fish in the sea forthwith. Joyless as back they rowed, was the giant speechless, did Hymir sit at the oars, with the rudder he sought a second wind. So running through the poetry with a quick breakdown, kinsman of Odin, aka Thor, is preparing to cast his line. The warder of men, the worm's destroyer, both different names for Thor, fixed on his hook the head of the ox, what he is using as bait. And then there, gaped at the bait, the foe of the gods, aka Jormungandr, the girdler of all the earth beneath, aka Jormungandr. The famous serpent, swiftly up to the boat did Thor the bold one pull. With his hammer, the loathly hill of the hair of the brother of Fenrir he smote from above. That line's a little tricky. Hill of the hair refers to the head, hair on the hill, aka the head. Yeah, I think that makes sense. So with his hammer, the head of the brother of Fenrir, Jormungandr, he smote from above. So with his hammer, Thor struck the head of Jormungandr from above. The line, the brother of Fenrir, is interesting because I think that is one of the only instances in which we get a gender for Jormungandr. Next few lines, the monster roars, the rocks resound, all the earth of old was shaken. That makes sense. Then sank the fish, aka Jormungandr, into the sea. Joyless back they rowed. The giant Hymir was speechless. He sat at the oars and sought his second wind. So Hymir was pretty shaken by the end of this encounter. And that's what I got. So jumping over to the Prose Edda, we're going to get a few kennings that touch on this same story. But first I wanted to talk about Snorri's little prose insertion. It's kind of interesting. I'll just summarize it real quick for you. So this is the, I guess, epilogue of Skaldskapermal, Prose Edda. I'm summarizing the Faulkes translation because I couldn't find it appearing anywhere in the Brodeur translation. I might have just missed it, but in the Faulkes translation, basically Snorri says that the accounts of Ragnarok were the events of the Trojan War, and that Thor using the ox head to pull Jormungandr onto the ship, but Jormungandr surviving by sinking back into the sea, was actually the story of how Hector used the head of the slain hero Völuspá, which is I think, misspelling of Poetic. I'm not that great at Greek names, so pardon me there. But so the story of how Hector used the head of the slain hero Poetic to lure Achilles to him, and then Achilles retreating after being wounded. So interesting equation with the Trojan War. And then Snorri continues with the equation by adding that Thor killed Hymir in his wrath after Jormungandr escaped, as Hector killed Rodrus when Achilles fled. Snorri then makes an interesting comment by saying that the Aesir did not like to admit that Thor was overthrown by one person, and they exaggerated when they said that Jormungandr suffered death there. So there's some versions of the story in which Jormungandr dies during this fishing trip when Thor smacks him on the head with a hammer. But Snorri's saying that that is an exaggeration because the Aesir did not like to admit that Thor was overthrown or defeated more or less by one person, by which I think they're meaning Jormungandr, aka Achilles. Yeah. Do with that what you will. I think that is purely Snorri's equation, although there could have been some, I hesitate to say truth to it, but some like tradition of that equation. I don't know, but as far as I know, it's only found in Snorri's account. Okay, on with the Kennings. So, Skaldskapermal, chapter 11, Brodeur translation. This is actually Kennings for Thor, and a lot of them relate to Jormungandr. So, we can refer to Thor as foe of the Midgard-Serpent. The line of Odin's offspring, Thor, lay not slack on the gunwale when the huge ocean serpent uncoiled on the sea's bottom. Interpretation: Thor's fishing line was very tight when Jormungandr uncoiled from the bottom of the sea. Then sang Ulfr Cutnose and Crop Ears. That's a heck of a name. The circler of all regions, and Jord the sun, sought each other. Next, and thus sang Eystein Valdason. With glowing eyes, Thrudr's father glared at the sea-road circler ere the fish's watery dwelling flowed in the boat confounding. So, with glowing eyes, Thor glared at Jormungandr while the sea washed into the boat. Again he sang. The earth fish tugged so fiercely that Ullr's kinsmen's clenched fists were pulled out past the gunwale, the broad planks rent asunder. Interpretation: Jormungandr tugged so fiercely that Thor's fists were pulled out past the edge of the boat, and the planks of the ship, the bottom of the ship, the hull, were broken. Then sang Bragi, the strong fiend's terrifier. In his right hand swung his hammer when he saw the loathly sea fish that all the lands confineth. I think that one makes sense. Thor with his right hand swung his hammer when he saw Jormungandr, who wraps around all the land. Thus sang Gamli, while the lord of high Bilskirnir, whose heart no falsehood fashioned, swiftly strove to shatter the sea fish with his hammer. Interpretation: Thor, who never lies, with his hammer tried to shatter Jormungandr. And I think that is it for the Thor Kennings. I love how the poetry sounds. Sometimes it does take a minute to interpret what's going on. If you are already familiar with these Kennings, I'm sorry for pausing to add my little interpretations in there. Although if the poetry was confusing for you, I hope the interpretations helped. As I start making more of these episodes and the Kennings become more familiar, maybe I will leave out the interpretations. We'll see how it goes. I think we just have a few more Kennings. These come from Skalskapermal, chapter 70 or 57 in the Faulkes translation, Prose, Brodeur translation. And these are Kennings for the earth. The broad ground neath the venom cold adder bound lies subject to the warrior. Country, as Ulfr Uggason sang. But the flashing-eyed, stiff edge rope of the earth stared past the gunwale at the rowan tree of the country, of stone, the giant tester. So that first one, the ground which is bound by the venom-cold adder, aka Jormungandr, lies subject to the warrior. Second one, this one's a little more interesting and I kind of like it. The flashing-eyed, stiff edge rope of the earth. that would be Jormungandr, stared past the gunwale, the edge of the ship, at the rowan tree of the country of stone, the giant tester, Thor. So both of those fantastic kennings for Jormungandr and Thor. And with that, we come to Ragnarok, the end, which is not the end, but it is the end, but not quite yet. Völuspá, stanzas 47 to 57, Poetic Edda. I'm going to read from both Bellows and Crawford. So starting with Crawford is stanzas 47 and 48. I'll take a little run up at Ragnarok. Fenrir howls terribly before the doors to hell. The wolf will break its bonds and run. I know much wisdom. I see deep into the future, all the way to Ragnarok, a dark day for the gods. Hrym advances from the east with a shield before him, and the Midgard-Serpent is in a monstrous rage. The serpent beats the waves. Jumping now to Bellows, stanza 55. The bright snake gapes to heaven above. Against the serpent goes Odin's son. In anger smites the warder of earth. Forth from their homes must all men flee. 9 paces fares the son of Fjörgyn, and slain by the serpent, fearless he sinks. The sun turns black, earth sinks in the sea. The hot stars down from heaven are whirled. Fierce grows the steam and the life-feeding flame till fire leaps high about heaven itself. And instead of pausing here to interpret, we're just going to jump right over to Gylfaginning, chapter 51, Prose Brodeur translation, because Snorri kind of interprets and elaborates for us there. So we get Snorri quoting Völuspá with a slightly different interpretation here. Hrym sails from the east, the sea floods onward, the monstrous beast twists in mighty wrath, the snake beats the waves, the eagle is screaming, the gold neb tears corpses, Naglfar is loosed. Jumping then to the prose bit. Then the sea shall gush forth upon the land, because the Midgard-Serpent stirs in giant wrath and advances up onto the land. Then that too shall happen, that Naglfar shall be loosed, the ship which is so named. It is made of dead men's nails, wherefore a warning is desirable, that if a man die with unshorn nails, that man adds much material to the ship Naglfar, which gods and men were fain to have finished late. Yet in this sea flood Naglfar shall float. Hrym is the name of the giant who steers Naglfar. Fenris wolf shall advance with gaping mouth, and his lower jaw shall be against the earth, but the upper against heaven. He would gape yet more if there were room for it. Fires blaze from his eyes and nostrils. The Midgard-Serpent shall blow venom, so that he shall sprinkle all the air and water, and he is very terrible, and shall be to one side of the wolf. The sons of Muspel shall go forth to that field which is called Vigridr. Thither shall come Fenris wolf also, and the Midgard-Serpent. Then Loki and Hrym shall come there also, and with him all the Rim giants. All the champions of Hel follow Loki, and the sons of Muspel shall have company by themselves, and it shall be very bright. The field, Vigrid, is 100 leagues wide each way. Odin rides first, with the gold helmet and a fair byrnie, and his spear which is called Gungnir. He shall go forth against Fenris wolf, and Thor stands forward on his other side, and can be of no avail to him, because he shall have his hands full to fight against the Midgard-Serpent. Thor shall put to death the Midgard-Serpent, and shall stride away 9 paces from that spot. Then he shall fall dead to the earth, because of the venom which the snake has blown at him. All right, that is going to bring us to the end of the Jormungandr attestations. I threw one final passage in here, because although it's not referring to Jormungandr specifically, I think it deals with some of the themes and topics that Jormungandr brings up, and I think it has some symbolic tie-ins. So this is from Gylfaginning, chapter 50, Brodeur translation of the Prose Edda. And this is Snorri's slightly expanded version of what occurs at the end of Lokasenna in the Poetic Edda, the binding of Loki. So I'm going to read through it and then we'll discuss. Now Loki was taken truceless and was brought with them into a certain cave. Thereupon they took 3 flat stones and set them on edge and drilled a hole in each stone. Then were taken Loki's sons, Vali and Narfi. The Asir changed Vali into the form of a wolf, and he tore asunder Narfi, his brother. And the Asir took his entrails and bound Loki with them over the 3 stones. One stands under his shoulders, the second under his loins, the third under his knees, and those bonds were turned to iron. Then Skadi took a venomous serpent and fastened it up over him so that the venom should drip from the serpent into his face. But Sigyn, his wife, stands near him and holds a basin under the venom drops, and when the basin is full, she goes and pours out the venom, but in the meantime, the venom drips into his face. Now, I never really noticed this connection until a little bit later in my personal practice, when I had some of the different items and representation of Loki and Loki's family up on my altar. But I found it interesting that the wolf and the serpent are both used as tools of torture for Loki in Loki's binding, when Vali is turned into a wolf and eats Loki's other son. And those 2, Vali and Narfi, are sons by Sigyn, but that then the serpent hung above Loki's face and dripping venom is also used as a means of torture. So we have the serpent, which is akin to Jormungandr, and the wolf akin to Fenrir, both being used to inflict harm onto Loki. Now this could possibly just be coincidence, but I'm inclined to dig a little deeper. I'm curious in the story if this was supposed to be an extra layer of like intentional mental anguish caused or put in place by the Asir, like, hi, you had a serpent and a wolf as children, and now we are using a serpent and a wolf to torture you and in your binding. Was that just meant to be an extra layer of harm? Was it unintentional? Or is it a statement being made either by the characters of the Asir or the writers, the tellers of these stories, about the destructive nature of serpents and wolves, about how they will bring harm to humans, or the Aesir trying to like drive home this point that your children are harmful, and thus we did this to them, and thus we will do X to them. Now, as I am definitely, sometimes I refer to myself as a Lokian, but as much as I include Loki and Loki's family in my personal practice, I do need to pump the brakes here on vilifying the Aesir and those who enacted these forms of torture. I also have Skadi on my altar. I don't think vilifying or making one party evil or the perpetrators of injustice is the quote-unquote right way to view these stories. Okay, let's start with this statement then. It is only natural for a wolf to eat and a serpent to be venomous. I think most of us can agree with that. Therefore, I think that the situation in this story is highlighting the tension between humanity's self-preservation and the order of the natural world. The situation of torture in the cave and the story of Ragnarok seem to indicate that these forces cannot coexist. And yet, is the human urge to self-preserve not natural as well? Perhaps the myth cycle and the circle of life are not that far apart. I once heard the saying that there is evil on every side. With the glass half full, there is good on every side. But with good and evil gone, and no sides to speak of, there is simply a circle going round. That is going to do it for today's episode. Thank you so much for joining today. If you would like to leave a comment, a review, you can do so on YouTube or Spotify, wherever you are listening. You can also reach me over email at heathentransgirlpodcast@gmail.com. And be sure to stop in next time as we discuss Jormungandr's brother, Fenrir.